All right, at this time we'd like to have Mark come up. You see? So we have a wonderful presentation. Actually, Mark and Bobby are going to work together on this. Their topic is CFO, CMO, making the connection on strategic risk assessment. And we thought that this would be a really fascinating one because we have, as we had earlier discussions, this interaction between marketing and the CFO and how best to handle that. Oftentimes we look at the budgeting process as being that interaction, which may not be the best time to have conversations when it's all about costs, right, as far as marketing. So they're going to present an alternative or a new view of a possibility. So with that, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Frank. And welcome to DePaul University, the Cal State Graduate School of Business. And thank you for the invitation to present. When Bobby contacted me initially with the idea, and then Frank followed up with the invitation to do the keynote, I thought, what a great opportunity to interact with discussion on how to integrate finance and marketing and accountability. I'm in the School of Accountancy and MIS at DePaul, and I also founded an interdisciplinary center at DePaul on strategy, execution, and valuation. The key there, the interdisciplinary aspect of that center is relevant for our discussion today because what we find is that risk management in most organizations is not interdisciplinary. It's siloed. It's in stovepipe risk management. That creates blind spots and it creates lack of identification of the risks in time for mitigation. The problem is that everybody speaks a different language in different functional areas. If you talk to the marketing people, they have a certain language, as does the finance, the CFO office, and so forth, right? And Bobby and I discussed that in our article, The Financial Value of Brand. This idea of trying to develop the common discussion so that they can work together, finance and marketing, to create greater value and a better perspective on risk assessment and risk management. The point that Frank mentioned about usually discussion with the CFO and marketing people is at the budget time. That's very bad timing, right? Especially in today's economic environment, right, where budgets are being cut in a number of different areas. So this presentation, we call it CFO CMO, making the connection between strategic risk assessment between those two areas. We developed together, Bobby and I did, this outline for our what we're going to present today. First, we're going to discuss the basics. What is risk? How do we define it? How do we understand it? How do we view it? And then the next question is, how do we assess it? And here we're going to talk about strategic risk management. And to do that requires a framing, a lens, or more than one lens to really understand strategic risks and how they interrelate and how they occur. Not necessarily quantifying risk. So Bob and I were talking about this before our presentation. A lot of risk experts want to go deep dive on quantifying risk at the detriment of really missing the important risks that are out there that create great suffering and destruction of value of companies. So we're going to present frameworks that are analytical and qualitative. Analytical and qualitative, not necessarily quantitative. And I think that logic leads to a better understanding of how to assess and manage risk. So there are basically three tools we're going to be discussing. One is the return-driven strategy framework, which is representative of high-performing companies globally. And I'll discuss that in a moment as far as how that framework works and how to use it. And then secondly, the second framework is the strategic risk management framework, understanding brand risk in that framework. The first one, return-driven strategy, is about how do brands create value. That's what needs to be communicated to CFOs and the CEOs and the boards of directors of companies. And then the third is a process. You know, we can take a framework and say, okay, here's a framework, let's try to use it. Okay, how do we use it? We use it using a strategic risk assessment process, a process that's continuous, so that every cycle of that process you get better at it. You improve the way you identify and manage risk. And if you don't do that, what happens is risk becomes an event and not a process, not a continuous process, not one that has action plans, not one that has action plans that are accountable to the participants, right? It also means engaging teams that are multidisciplinary. You know, the problem with different disciplines, in academia, Bobby, I know this, right? Every department has its own language, right? Has its own journals and its own way of thinking. The same is true in companies, right? All those functional areas, finance and marketing, they speak different languages, right? I do a lot of work in terms of, as a board member of a cybersecurity company, in terms of how do we best assess cybersecurity risk, which is a big deal now, as we all know. You need to do so with interdisciplinary teams. And that's where the marketing and finance interaction will play a very valuable role for the CMO and the CFO and the CEO and board of directors, for that matter. An education process is needed to do that, and that's where that risk assessment process comes in. And then we have one more tool, and that's the life cycle of companies. The life cycle of companies is based upon finance, literature of finance and strategy. And we find that companies, as we all know, if you're a high-performing company, ultimately you can fade, right? You can fade to the average because of competition. Brands, the work that Bobby and I are doing together, we find that strategic investments in brands can help companies resist the competitive fade. We'll discuss that in our presentation as well. And then Bobby has a very interesting example, a new example of brand purpose, you know, and I'm looking forward to hearing that myself because this is going to be a surprise to me. I have not heard it. I've seen some slides, but I was not briefed yet on. I'm in suspense, Bobby, but that's a great marketing tool, right? Okay, so let's begin with the basics. Okay, what is risk? If someone asks you what is risk, I go to my friend and research colleague Mike Porter at Harvard Business School, who in 1985 defined risk as follows. Risk is a function of how poorly a strategy will perform if the wrong scenario occurs. The key there is he's making the connection between strategy and risk, which makes sense, which still, by the way, is lacking in most ERM, enterprise risk management programs today, which are isolated, you know, siloed risk management functions. Another definition from COSO. So COSO is an organization of the accounting organizations such as AICPA in the United States, IMA, Institute of Management Accountants, and other Financial Executives International. And they spend their time on internal controls and risk management, and particular enterprise risk management. So this is a quote from a report that I did with Richard Anderson, who was one of my clinical professors in my center here at DePaul, and also a retired senior partner from PwC in the accounting world. And we define strategic risks refer to those events and risks that could impair the company's ability to achieve its strategies, as Mike Porter said, and business objectives. That's common sense, isn't it? But most companies have not embraced that view of risk. They have a very siloed, narrow view of risk. That was 2020. And that by the way, that particular reference, that COSO paper, is available online and very useful. Good examples, great examples from board members, CFOs, and marketing executives as well. Okay, this is a longer definition, okay? They're not going to get any longer than this one. So this is from a 2017 book I wrote with Richard Anderson for the IIA, Institute of Internal Auditors Research Foundation. This is for internal auditors and for those who are auditing risk management and auditing how risk can be better assessed. So here we define it as strategic risks are those events and risks that are most consequential to the organization's ability to execute its strategies and achieve its objectives. These are the risk exposures that ultimately affect, in significant ways, shareholder value, the value of the company, stock price, the value of the company, or the viability and existence of the company. As we've seen, many companies can go out of business quickly if they're really bad at managing and mitigating risk in time, especially in today's environment, because the pace of change is so fast. And so then we ask the question, okay, how do you manage risk? How do you do it? So here's from 2000, something I wrote in 2008. 2008 was a very pivotal year, wasn't it, in terms of risk? So I wrote this article, when strategy and ERM, enterprise risk management, meet, how they need to be integrated. And what I said is strategic risk management needs to examine how well a business strategy will perform under different scenarios. Very important in today's environment, right? Scenario planning, much more popular in Europe than it is in America. In American companies and business schools, scenario analysis is kind of like put off to the side, right? In European companies, they use it predominantly as, for example, I'm going to go through a Lego group case study where they use it very ambitiously and very well to assess risk. It can result in significant losses, destruction in shareholder value, or damage to the corporate reputation and or brand. I know they're different. Bobby's going to discuss that today, the difference between brand and reputation. They're separate, they're related in certain ways, but they're different in terms of how we manage them. They're different in terms of the way that we assess the risk inherent in them. Balancing, right? I have a graphic up there. Balancing means balancing the threats and opportunities that are in the forces of change, right? The pillow is risk management. Hopefully it saves from a desperate fall. But here's the way it is at most companies, whether they will admit it or not. This is how risk management looks the way it is status quo in most companies. It's called silo approach to risk management. Every single one of those silos is separate. Operations risk, finance risk, human capital risk, IT risk, legal risk, reputation risk, all separate, not connected together. What that results in is lack of communication between the risk areas, lack of information sharing. So how many times have you heard the story where executives will say, oh, well, we had that information, but it wasn't being shared in the right way with the right people at the right time before things got really bad? Well, guess what? That should be good management 101 and good risk management 101. So these stovepipes are still in existence today. ERM, enterprise risk management, came about in the last 15 years to help integrate those silos and create that via reporting enterprise-wide. And then also a very important aspect of ERM, enterprise risk management, is, and also focusing not only on the threats, but on the opportunities in forces of change. The companies that are the high-performing companies that we study and have studied for 20 plus years, 25 years in our research, we find that those companies do a much better job managing the threats and opportunities in forces of change before other companies, more so than other companies. Force of change is a big issue now because we have, and that would be social issues, economic, regulatory, technology, all those breed certain opportunities and risks for any company. So here's the Lego group. I mentioned the Lego group. I had the opportunity over several years to work with the director of strategic risk management, Hans Leso. And they didn't have an ERM department. They didn't have enterprise risk management at Lego in 2007, 2006. The CFO led this initiative. The CFO is the one who said, we need a strategic risk management process that works. We need it to be integrated in that integrated in that Lego umbrella. They always have a good way of putting things, right? Lego, it's very inventive. And ERM is simply a reporting mechanism. That's all it is. They don't even have an ERM department. In fact, when Hans and I have presented our work at risk management conferences where there's directors of ERM and chief risk officers and the consulting firms that serve them, we get attacked. They say, how can you say that you don't need an ERM department? ERM is we have a huge ERM department. Yes, it's a big bureaucracy that does a lot of unnecessary risk assessments and nothing becomes of it, right? There are some political in companies points of view that ERM should be broad-based. He started it by himself, hired one person. Lego's a very big global company, as you know, very successful company. And then 3 years later, he hired a second person. Not a big department, right? Not a big budget drain. And they created huge amounts of value for Lego. I can't say how much because it's a private company, right? But you just look at the standing of Lego over the last 10 or 15 years, how they have really transformed the company in meaningful ways. And part of that was taking risks, aggressively taking risks, by the way, including during the pandemic. So another thing that came up in terms of the Lego case was the idea of a risk profile. So ERM processes often develop what they call a heat map. A heat map is two-dimensional. Heat map would be likelihood and impact. Likelihood and impact. Likelihood and impact. And you know something? Usually the heat map is missing one or two, or maybe more than that, dimensions to it. So we added, not to likelihood and impact, we added velocity. How fast does the risk happen, or could it happen, right? And then the second thing we added was readiness. Preparedness. How prepared is the company to handle that risk? So with that process in mind, think about today. They say things happening as fast or faster than ever before, and they're going to continue to happen quickly, as we know. Velocity in risk management looks like this, right? We know that, for example, a tornado versus a hurricane have different velocity. For a hurricane, you have multiple days to prepare for it. With a tornado, it could be minutes, right? In that point of view. So velocity of risk is very important to recognize as one of the dimensions. And Lego does that in terms of, they call it speed of the risk. How quickly, what's the speed of that risk, right? And they also look at the impact, right? And that's their way, that's their heat map, but it's a much bit more useful heat map. Okay, what are the tools that you can use? These are the lenses, the frameworks that I mentioned earlier in the introduction. And now we have the balancing, now we have the crocodiles or alligators, whatever you want to call them, the risks that are down there, right? Again, it's balancing the threats and opportunities. So here's a toolkit that I would recommend, and Bobby and I would recommend. It would be the book Driven, which describes the return-driven strategy framework. The article that I did with Bobby on the financial value of brand, and then the COSO strategic risk assessment research report, which gives you step-by-step how to use the frameworks and how to use it. You can use it in brand as well. Adapt, don't adopt. So it's easy to use parts of it as needed. But those are the three tools. The premise of the strategy framework that you can use in terms of risk management and risk assessment is return-driven strategy. And it's based upon a question. What can we learn from high-performing companies? What can we learn from high-performing companies in the way they manage risk, threats, and opportunities? What can we learn from high-performing companies, sustainable high-performing companies, in terms of what are their strategic activities, regardless of industry, size, and part and area of the world? And that's in the return-driven strategy framework. But when we say high-performing companies, if I ask you, what's a high-performing company, you might say, well, it could be the company that I bought stock in and I made a lot of money on it, right? But that's one dimension, right? The stock price, right? Or it could be a company that got some good press recently in the Wall Street Journal or whatever, Forbes, Fortune. What we did, myself and Joe Littman, clinical professor Joe Littman, both of us are CPAs, by the way. The CPA the CPA credential and expertise and discipline came in very handy to understand what makes a high-performing company. And what we did is we developed 3 criteria. And think about this as I go through them. Does this make sense? We studied 20,000 companies globally using 20 to 30 years of data, using the Credit Suisse Holt database, using, in the case of 20 to 30 years of data, they have that history going back depending on how long the company's been in existence, any mergers and acquisitions. So here are the 3. Number 1, this is for a sustainable high-performing company. Number 1, superior and sustainable return on investment. We define that as at least 2x, twice the cost of capital. That's very difficult, and over 10 years or more of consecutive years, sustainable. Most companies can't say they've done that. Business cycles, other shocks to the system, and so forth. Why do we choose 2x? Because we wanted materiality. We said, look, we don't want to just say they had ROIs above the cost of capital. We want to say they had ROIs at least twice the cost of capital. Gives you a big margin of error, right? And we use cash flow ROI, inflation adjusted, to make it more comparable. So that was number 1. And then for companies that achieve that, we said, did they have disciplined growth? That means they grew their investment in capital, CapEx, R&D, and brand greater than the amount they invested, greater than GDP. So we just want to say, did they have real increases in their invested capital, tangible and intangible capital investments? But while maintaining that 2x spread in ROI. So that sounds like a great business, right? ROIs at least twice the cost of capital plus growing the business. That's ROI plus G equals value creation, right, in any kind of finance model. And that's what part 3 is. Part 3 is the outcome. Superior shareholder returns, total shareholder returns relative to the market. Every one of these companies that met criteria 1 and 2 achieved superior total shareholder returns, which would be capital appreciation plus dividends, relative to the market. Except companies that violated tenet 1, which I'll get to in a moment. In other words, they had great ROIs, they had great disciplined growth and investments, but they violated a tenet, I'll mention in a minute, that did not allow them to benefit in the stock market. In fact, they suffered tremendously by destroying shareholder value. It's called the commitment tenet. This is the framework. The commitment tenet is 3 words: ethically maximize wealth. Wealth simply means accumulated value created. That's all it means. Accumulated value created, wealth. Ethically means adhering to the parameters and values of your constituents as they define them. As they define them. Consistently, without exception. We call it the commitment tenet because we want to examine how companies are managed, their executive teams and their overall activity. We look at what have been the ethical breaches of the company, lawsuits and so forth. Lawsuits against them for violating IP, for example, and other areas. Reputation risk is impacted by that, so is brand risk. Maximize wealth, good stewardship, accountability of resources, right? MASB. Accountability of resources. Maximize wealth means creating the most long-term value creation with your resources. Not short-term value creation, long-term value creation. I think that's very consistent with the mission of MASB in terms of accountability. How do we study companies using this? We look at their compensation. We look at how do the executives get paid, DEF 14A with the SEC. Are they based on short-term measures which breed, unnecessary acquisitions, which create greater comp for the executives but destroy shareholder value? We look at earning call forensics in our research, where we're looking at how they say it in terms of voice analysis. We look at how they present their brand and their reputation, internally within the company and externally, in terms of consistency. So that's tenet 1. So we look at companies from a valuation point of view for investors. If a company violates tenet 1, we say don't bother with the rest of the pyramid. But the rest of the pyramid describes how companies make money, create value by creating value for the customers, right? And those would be the goal tenets. The goal tenets would be customer focused. The goal tenets are fulfill otherwise unmet customer needs, which was mentioned previously in our discussion today, and target customer groups with those needs. And hopefully those customer groups are increasing. So tenet 2, which it would be the fulfill otherwise unmet needs, usually means what? Usually means we create a lot of value for the customer. Usually means we have the ability for price premiums that create greater profit margins, right? Profit margins, and then add to that tenet 3, which would be target appropriate customer groups with those needs. Hopefully, those groups are increasing, not decreasing, right? So if we have high ROIs plus targeting groups with those needs that are increasing, we have ROI through margins, and we have growth in terms of who they're looking at. Now, companies that are targeting downward sloping markets, like I think Harley-Davidson, are going to face challenges in terms of the valuation. Harley-Davidson was one of the companies we studied and identified as a high-performing company in 2007, based upon previous time period. Now they're not so high performance anymore due to demographics and other challenges they've had, and branding challenges they've had in recent years. So those are the goal tenets. We say the goal of any business, startup, mid-size, large company, is to create value for customers, right? So how do companies do this? The goal tenets. We call those the competency tenets. Now brand's I see the eyes light up here, brand offerings, okay? 3 competency tenets every organization needs. Means innovate offerings, deliver offerings, and brand offerings aligned with the customer's otherwise unmet needs, and to do so by targeting those customer groups ethically and creating ethical value in the process. By the way, brand offerings here means, brand is a verb here. It means actively branding your offering, product, service, whatever it might be, the entirety of it, the way you design it, the way you produce it, the way you deliver it, the way you service it, how it impacts sustainability, right? All those things, how it impacts safety and so forth, all that comes into the equation of tenet 6, which is brand offering, which we'll discuss in more detail. And then how do you do these competency tenets? We do that by the supporting tenets. You partner deliberately, but you only partner with other organizations if the partnering allows you to do things you couldn't do yourself. Meaning how to innovate the offering, how to deliver the offering, how to brand the offering. So organizations often need help in branding the offering. They seek other organizations to partner with. Could be a consulting firm, could be a valuation firm, could be another company to help them co-brand their offerings. Map and redesign processes. This is the value chain, right? So we know that during the pandemic, a lot of companies suffered because of the supply chain disruptions, right? And that's because most of them had not thought through the map and redesign processes in case the wrong scenario happens, right? Disruption in the supply chain where there's no backup, right? And many companies suffer from that. So these are some of the underlying. Engage employees and others. Employees are a great asset and value creator for companies. They can also be a great risk. One employee can create great harm to a company, including its brand. Balance, focus, and options means balance your current business plus growth options. You can't just do one. No status quo. If you basically focus on we're taking care of business, no, you have to move on to the growth strategy. And then communicate holistically is communicating internally and externally in the same way, so everybody understands the brand, the purpose of the company, and the same consistency is out there on the outside communication. Those are the 11 tenets. And go ahead, please.
Have you considered, coming at it from a brand perspective, putting brand, you've got to brand the offerings, that just means naming and branding. I think you might want to consider putting brand on your second layer, because you have to fulfill your otherwise unmet customer needs and target the appropriate customer groups through the lens of having defined what your brand stands for and how it crystallizes your strategy of ethically maximizing wealth.
So I agree. I think that what your brand stands for is important, and Bobby will talk about brand purpose in the second part of our presentation. Not an easy question to address, but you get down to the genuine assets is the brand itself and the IP and the intellectual property, right? So genuine assets would be the intangible and tangible assets and resources a company has. So that could be intellectual property, deep domain expertise, the brand itself, the trademarks, and all of those. The AI capabilities currently, by the way, would be a genuine asset. Lacking them would be a risk factor for most companies. So those are, yes.
I don't know if this was your point, but I feel like the brand strategy should shower down the whole thing, like
Yes.
or cascade on many of those boxes.
So cascades through the whole.
It should be in there somewhere near the top.
Yes.
Because if your customer fulfilling your customer needs and targeting appropriate customer groups, if that's not done in a way, kind of it implies the ones that fit with your brand, but it should say.
It's like a filter for.
Yeah. A top level, a sort of second level filter.
One thing to mention is that all these tenants, the boxes, are strategic activities. And they're all interrelated. They're not really separate. And they all change, by the way. So that pyramid in the background is not a pyramid. We do call it a pyramid sometimes, but it's the symbol delta, the letter delta in mathematics, which is the symbol of change. We mean everything changes there, right? Unmet need change, demographics of your customers change, the ability to innovate your offerings changes, the ability to deliver your offering changes due to technology, regulation, you name it, right? Even branding.
And John, isn't there like this is the strategy and here's like.
Brand is the crystallization of business strategy.
Yeah.
And the lens through which it's distributed. So it belongs somewhere near the top.
We're bringing
Things
up
don't
stable,
work
okay.
with your brand purposes, don't you?
I realize we're marketers, so of course we see it this way.
Yeah.
Most business people at a higher level, though, see it as a multifaceted.
This isn't a higher level. There is no higher level. See, brand is the embodiment of business strategy. It is business strategy.
Okay, so this second foundation is vision, force of change. This is where risk management comes in. Vision, the force of change means managing the opportunities and threats in forces of change. Those forces of change could be socioeconomic, economic growth, regulatory or deregulatory, technology, you name it, right? Those all impact potentially all those strategic activities and give you both risk and opportunities. And then finally, here's where we talk about metrics. Discipline, performance measurement, and valuation, meaning that performance measures of an organization, including marketing performance measures, need to be highly aligned with value creation and valuation. So we hear a lot of like customer acquisition costs is a major metric that marketing uses to get a better investment on their marketing expenditures and ROI. And people discuss marketing return on investment, on marketing investment, right? That's difficult to measure per se, but it can be done qualitatively using these frameworks. So here's what we found. We found that companies using this framework, around the globe, we found that they naturally started to use it for risk management. And if you take a look at each side, we flip it over, we end up with the strategic risk management framework. If you fail to ethically maximize wealth, you're going to face investor risk. If you fail to fulfill otherwise unmet customer needs, you face customer risk. If you fail to innovate your offerings, you face innovation risk, and so forth and so on. If you fail to map and redesign and manage your processes and supply chain, you face supply chain risk. And then we have the genuine assets at risk on the bottom there include brand risk, and it would include IP risk. And we look at the forces of change like sustainability risk in terms of a force of change, right? Currently and it's continuing. Regulatory risk, right? Regulatory and deregulatory risk is impacting every company nowadays, globally, right? And then we look at the very bottom here, the financial risk, the valuation risk, fraud risk, in terms of performance measurement. We look at, when companies publish false financial reports, which happens often, the market is merciless as far as, the company itself. Or even minor metrics that are disclosed to the offering. So the one on the left, return-driven strategy, that helps you understand how brands create value. The risk management framework helps you understand the impact, the interrelated risks, including brand risk for an organization. And that leads to the process. The process itself, it's seven steps. And this process has been used by many companies around the world, led by the CFO group, the CEO group, I present this at boards of directors, and it begins, step one is understand the strategy of the company using return-driven strategy. Understand the brand strategy of the company using return-driven strategy. So we can narrow it down to brand in this particular case. Gather data and views on strategic risks in this case, about the brand. Prepare a preliminary risk profile. Preliminary because we're going to want to fine tune it. We want it to be reviewed, right? And we want to validate the profile. We want to keep number 5, develop an action plan. What are you going to do about those risks? Step 6 is communicate the strategic action plan, and then implement it, and then full circle. You know, so many times, from 2008 to 2018, 10 years, I was on the road all over the world. New Zealand, Singapore, Europe, South America, throughout North America. I was presenting this at CFO summits, right? And at the lunch table, I'd often ask a question. I'd say, so to the CEO or CFO, I'd say, what is your company doing in the area of risk assessment, right? And usually they would always say something like this: oh yes, we hired the XYZ consulting firm or the XYZ CPA firm to do a risk assessment. And I said, okay, what happens after that? Well, we or they reported an abbreviated version of that risk assessment to our audit committee or our board of directors. Okay. Sounds good. And then I asked the following question. And then what happens? Silence. Because nothing happens in those companies. Basically, the board, the audit committee, and the executive team have been briefed on the risk profile, the risk assessment, usually a lot of risks, by the way, but no action plan, right? That's the hardest part, but it's the most important part to do, right? I mean, you can imagine doing a marketing strategy and saying, oh, we don't have an action plan for it, right? Would it work? Of course it would not work. So that's the process. You can adapt it as needed. And we know it works because we've used it at a lot of companies. I use it today. In fact, I used it with the COSO board of directors, this particular framework, to have COSO, the organization itself, use it for the, eat your own gourmet food, so to speak, right? This article, these articles are all indexed and available to the attendees, PDF form. This article talks about the necessity of having an interdisciplinary team involved in strategic risk assessment, including the marketing executives, right? And I think this is a good article if you're CMOs and want to communicate this to your CFO. It's a good way to to bridge the gap. Hans Laso, very innovative and very successful risk management person, but he wasn't. But he wasn't a risk management expert. He was hired by the CFO. He was told by the CFO, Hans, I want you to develop a strategic risk assessment process. And he had no background. He had to look up, research what is ERM, right? But he did know the business. He was a controller, and he knew the business as an engineer. He's a mathematician, and so he was able to develop this process, the Lego risk. This, by the way, is a great way to look at risk management in your organization. It's great. It's good practice. But here's their risk. I mentioned the risk profile before. Speed of change on the side, and likelihood, right? Speed of change and likelihood. How fast can the risk occur, and how likely is it? So with brand risk, a lot of brand risk would be fast, happens quickly, could happen quickly, right? And likelihood is high that it could happen. There we have to have action plans already in place, right? Act. If it's fast but slow to occur, then we prepare for it. If it's slow, but it could happen most likely, we adapt to it slowly. And if it's slow and low, in terms of slow speed and low likelihood, we don't forget about it, we park it temporarily, right? But this helps us prioritize risk. Board of directors love this framework because it's got the legal colors, number one, and also it gives them actionability, right? It gives them actionability. They map their risk on this framework and helps them understand what should we do now, what should we do first. So one more tool I'm going to go through. I'm going to turn over to Bobby for his example, and that is the life cycle framework. By the way, all of this we teach in our SEV, Strategy, Execution, Evaluation graduate course here, and in our executive education programs, to look at how to use all these frameworks. Now, the life cycle framework, it's based upon the value creation book on the right side. But the way it looks is as follows. Here's a high innovation company on the left side. Let me describe these lines for a moment. So the red line would be the economic returns, ROI. The dotted green line would be reinvestments in the company. CapEx, R&D is capitalized here, and you could also do the same with investments in the brand, which we're currently experimenting with. So companies in the high innovation stage, like a startup, for example, spend a lot of time investing in technology, R&D, brand, and their ROIs usually are negative at first, right? And hopefully they find increases. So what companies would you think would be here currently in the high innovation? Any companies in the AI space or?
All of the companies in the AI.
Yeah. We put Tesla in there, but they've had kind of a bumpy road really recently in terms of brand. But the most important area is right here, the competitive fade area, second phase. That's where these are high performing companies that are starting to fade because they become complacent, right? When they become complacent, they stop investing because guess what? The financials are good, everybody's making money, the comp is good, let's keep moving, but you're not reinvesting. This is the most dangerous part. If you do that, you end up in the mature business phase where you're following the business cycle and ultimately the trouble business phase. So we identified, Kraft Heinz failed to invest in its brands, right? In terms of, recently. And what companies do you think are in the competitive fade? Means they've got great ROIs, however, they face the risk of their brand fading. Which companies do you think would be in that?
Well, a brand I'd bring up is Gillette. A brand I'd bring up is Gillette.
Gillette,
which
okay.
is part of Procter & Gamble, and with Harry's and
All those
gloves,
specialty brands, right?
They've probably kind of.
Yeah, shaving has
phase.
become much more confusing, right? In terms of the brands, that's true.
More people will have beards. And more people have beards.
Right. Oh yeah. Okay. So,
The other day, but
well, the idea here is to reinvest in the brands, and that's where we leave off for something that Bobby's going to discuss, because we talk about corporate purpose and brand purpose, and one of the keys there would be to try to connect purpose with brand strategy, and also within the context of this framework. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Bobby Calder, to continue the presentation. I can't wait to hear the example.
Mark refers to this as my fish story. It's very, very much ongoing, and it may really be a fish story ultimately, but it's kind of interesting, I think. The example Mark gave you was an example of using brand in a conversation with financial types. Maybe they have this risk management apparatus already, large company, as a way of plugging in to make the point that brand can help you face a risk. You understand what a risk is if you're a finance person, and if I talk to you in terms of something you can understand, you're more likely to pay attention to it, right? So realize there's this generic phenomena out there called, whatever you want to call it, but life cycle, and this notion of fade. And even though your impulse may be to control expenses, there's an argument for brand. It's sort of a way of having that conversation rather than, hey, we got to invest all this money and it's going to work wonders. Let me give you an example that's more strategic, though. Talking about brand purpose as a strategy, and I'll come back to that. But really, I want to illustrate this notion of mitigating a strategy to avoid risk. And that's an argument to be made with finance people, right? So the strategy we'll get to, but let's take the brand first, right? So let me tell you about the brand, and we'll come back to brand purpose. The brand is the Tutwaba brand. You've never heard of it, I assume. Tutwaba is a fish. It's a very large fish that grows in the Sea of Cortez, which is between Baja and mainland Mexico. It's a very ancient fish. It's only surviving member of its genus. It's a species of fish, right? It's not well known even in Mexico, except for historical reasons. It's known to exist, but people never consumed it broadly. There's no way historically to ship it, that kind of thing. It's got a checkered history. The Chinese, about 30 years back, figured out that it has a swim bladder, and it's a Chinese thing. They thought that the swim bladder had health properties, and just like with several other things, they developed a real desire to have this and pay thousands of dollars. So this fish was totally overfished, selling the bladders to China, usually just discarding the actual fish. It reached a point where the government of Mexico tried to protect it, and the cartels got involved and were shipping it illegally, right? Which then the Mexican government made it illegal even to sell this fish at retail, even in Baja, right? So it reached a point, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, that it was just deteriorating, right? It was just, the only thing going on was illegal activity. At this point, interestingly enough, a startup group called the Earth Ocean Farms saw this as an opportunity. They were actually starting wanted to get into the aqua fishing business, fish farming business. So they went to the Mexican government and said, look, we'll revive this fish population. We'll farm it in the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Cortez, and we'll not only sell it to support the activity, but we'll also release fish back into the environment, right? So we'll try to sustain the population. So the Mexican government bought it, and so they created these fish reservoir tanks out in the Sea of Cortez, and stocked them with fish, right? On land, this is across from La Paz. On land, they built this rather huge plant, essentially, in conjunction with the fish tanks. What you have to do is have mother fish on land that actually spawn and give you the young fish, right? Which you then have to process. It's quite a sophisticated operation. You have to take through stages. It's like 4 or 5 stages of growth where they have to be fed a special diet in little tanks, and eventually they even have to be treated with all kinds of chemicals so that their immune system doesn't react, and they put in the tank. Okay? And then eventually they are harvested and taken back to a production plant on land. So the reason I tell you all this is it's expensive, right? Very expensive investment. I mean, really, really expensive. And the people here obviously have deep pockets. When I first encountered them, this was kind of the situation. They invested all this money in and realized that what it meant is to get any kind of return on investment, they had to sell a lot of these fish. Okay? I mean, a lot of these fish, right? And part of the objective then had to be to do that, and they also had a good corporate purpose. They were truly interested in sustainability, right? But they realized they had a problem. Turns out Mexico is a very low fish eating country, consumer-wise. Strange, just, bi-coastal, but people don't eat fish, right? Some, but not very much at all relative to other things. And also it was clear that Mexicans don't really differentiate fish very much. There's sushi, there's salmon, and kind of everything else. It's kind of a blur, right? Just fish. And you're talking about selling a particular kind of fish, right? So they had a strategy. The strategy was, let's introduce this fish in high-end restaurants, okay? And get it well known because of that. And then the awareness that you get from that will transfer over to support supermarket distribution, right? I've done a lot of work for a brand in Mexico called Food, F-U-D. It's a pretty huge brand in Mexico. So I met these people, and they didn't particularly know what a brand was. They're mostly finance people. But can we brand this fish? Well, yeah, but you're going to have to understand consumers to do that, right? So I set out on a mission to do research with Mexican consumers to try to figure out how to do this fish. So at first, the thing to do was talk to the target group, which was at that point restaurant chefs, influencers on the internet, foodie influencers, and sort of pretty upscale consumers dined in high-end restaurants, mainly in Monterrey and Mexico City, maybe a few other cities, Merida, a few others, but basically people that you would expect to be eating at a pretty expensive restaurant, right? So when you talk to them, they like the sustainability. You start talking to them about this is a sustainable effort, fine and good. But it became apparent very early that the chefs were very, I'll say, reluctant, because you essentially, in their eyes, were telling them to substitute this low margin item for dishes or traditional dishes, which were very high margin. And while they applauded the effort, and actually, if you demoed the fish for them, they found it very nice because it's easy to cook with, right? Very versatile. But they wanted none of it, right? Then talk to consumers. Well, turns out consumers, not surprisingly, given what I just said, will tell you, I don't know much about fish. But it was clear beyond that eating in high-end restaurants in Mexico had a whole consumer psychology to it. You ate to as much for social reasons as for appetite reasons. You ate to show status, to show face, to fit into a group. and not to stand apart from the group. Usually it's sort of a celebratory occasion. A meal might last a couple hours, that kind of thing. And the long and short of it was to order fish in the company of other sort of face showing, macho, actually, people, especially colleagues, was not something you wanted to do. Even if you maybe had a little health concern in the back of your mind if you were younger, no, not. I'm going to stick with the main Mexican meals, which are heavily meat oriented, very meat oriented food culture, right? So the question was what to do. Very tricky marketing situation, right? Branding situation. How do you get people to think about something that clearly belongs in the fish category, but don't think of it as a fish? Can be done, right? Can be done. A stock example is, if I say tomato, you think vegetable, right? It's a fruit. You know it's a fruit, but you can think about it as a vegetable. That's a little tricky to pull off from scratch, right? So, you listen to consumers, and after doing a lot of one-on-one interviews with about 50 consumers, it sort of dawned on us that there was an opportunity around a brand that was celebratory and a real experience that you could have at a high-end restaurant that was like eating meat, but wasn't meat. It was, yes, it is fish, but think of it as a celebratory experience, right? Think about it as something that other people will think you're still high status for doing. So we came up with the positioning, classic positioning statement. When you choose Tatwaba, you'll enjoy a superior whitefish experience with unique flavors that will become one of your favorite dishes. Kind of the key word there is favorite dishes. Don't think about it as fish so much as a fish that's going to become a favorite dish, something that really stands out in your mind, right? And immediately you start getting marketing thoughts, like one idea we had right off was try to tell the chefs, don't put it under the fish section of the menu, make it a special item, right? It's tricky to work with, but could be done, right? It's a little better in Spanish. This verb sabores means translates flavor, but it has a little deeper meaning of sort of knowing and understanding. So we took that back to consumers and started concept testing it, and it turned out to work pretty well. They got the concept, they got the idea. It evolved so that we could do a sales pitch to chefs that you have to talk about it this way. And a key thing that always the consumer will point out was, what's really important here is how the waiter explains it. I understand the concept and what you're saying, that's why it's on the menu the way it is, but the waiter really needs to really make it a little more concrete for me. And what we came up with is this phrase, exquisite, firm, and juicy. That sounds simple, but it seemed to do the trick for consumers. The way we test it is this is a little projected test, and this is a waiter. I don't know if you can see it, but fill in the blurb. Standard kind of projected technique, and you would very often get something like this. Sometimes a few synonyms, but it all boiled down to this, right? So this became the messaging. We actually wrote scripts for waiters. Chefs could give them to present it this way. And people started ordering. Right? It's still early days, but so far so good, right? against some real problems you could have run into, right? So the brand is doing its work. So this is the materials on the web and the stuff influencers got. They always show the explanation and then a beauty shot of some dish, right? A dish. Well, here's where we're going. Back to risk. Back to risk. I just gave you a brand strategy, and it seems like it's working. You can always think about risk for brand strategy, right? I don't know many marketers actually walk in, especially a high-level meeting, and start talking about risk. They talk about how great this brand is, right? But you really should think about risk in just the sense that Mark was talking about. It's possible threats. And you might not have all the apparatus that is in place in the risk world for having that conversation, but you could have it with anybody if you approached it that way. So what's the threat here to this brand as I describe it?
Other fish.
Pardon?
Other fish.
Yeah, but the other fish are really not in the game, right? I love sushi if I'm a Mexican consumer. I know salmon, yeah, I know that still stands out. Fish, it's, if I'm sick or my kid or something, but yeah.
Yeah, for this to work, you have to have a lot of volume, and your positioning is as a favorite dish so that it becomes something people look forward to and they buy a lot. But a lot of times to get people to do it the first time, those are the people who are, a lot of people buy or try something new to kind of show that they're interested. But those people are also trying something new every time, right? They never stay with the same thing because they want to be continually interested, which is not a good volume strategy.
Yeah,
So
that's
the conversion from, aren't I cool? Because I'm trying this thing you guys never heard of. Oh, it's great. But then next time I'm going to have the pig head or something because now that's cool.
yeah, that's certainly a part of it. That's a part of the threat.
Uneven preparation.
Yeah, very definitely.
Well, it suggests that if the chefs aren't used to preparing fish, they need some help in making sure they're doing it the very, very best way.
Yeah. Right on. The threat, though, that really they faced, they seem to be okay with the restaurant side. So what's their strategy? They want to go to supermarkets and sell it mass. Every marketer knows that if you start switching from specific distribution to mass distribution, watch out, right?
So they're gonna run out of supply if the demand is,
Well, yeah,
it'll get expensive.
that would be the least risk for them, yeah, because they could grow a lot of these fish.
I mean, it's hard to translate that experience into frozen food or retail environment. Missing that trick in the magic of
Yeah,
the way you can talking to everything.
Yeah, all the things you said, and consumer insight was there to be had. Look, I could see ordering this in a restaurant, but if they're selling it in Walmart, is that special? How could it be special, right?
Isn't this is like the Red Bull strategy? It's almost exactly what Red Bull did. So they started, it was a Thai health drink. Nobody ever heard of it, it was only drunk in Thailand. And they took it and branded it with the idea it gives you wings, energizes mind and body, which is still the idea of the brand and the purpose. And they put it into little cans to make it say, don't drink it in large quantities, it's very special. And for a long time it was only available in special fridges in high-end bars. No retail, no supermarket distribution whatsoever. And they did it very gradually. And they also, which I don't know if, there's the money behind it to do it for the fish, they also had a very sophisticated marketing strategy. They didn't spend much money to start with. It was cartoons about, high sports and stupid stunts and things. So they did it. And I think that the right marketing and a gradual approach is maybe part of the answer.
Well, it's a parallel example to this, but notice what they did. They had a brand strategy. They were going to possibly experience risk if they expanded. So their job was to come up with a strategy for dealing with that risk,
Exactly.
right? That's a thought process I don't think you see today.
I think Nespresso is an interesting example of what you're talking about. We started out in the high-end restaurants, private clubs, and airline lounges to, establish that it's really good coffee. The strategy was to go retail, but we realized that you could do retail, but it was super expensive. You have to have a special store with, both the machines and the pods and so on. And so we decided to do a subscription replenishment strategy in place of retail and lower the risk of failure. So, and we got lucky. George Clooney agreed to be the spokesperson, but the strategy worked.
Yeah, and this is something marketers know how to deal with. All I'm saying is, this is couching it in a different way to talk to the kind of people Mark is representing, right? We're saying, look, we've got a strategy. You should be evaluating strategic risk. Is there a risk here? If yes, devise a strategy to mitigate that risk, right? That's finance language for what we're talking about is okay, that's what marketers do, right? So where we are here is what's the strategy, right? Espresso, Red Bull, but what's the strategy here? Well, the company first thought, well, I brought up the idea of brand purpose as a possible strategy that could make the brand work in a supermarket context, right? They said, oh, we already got that. Sustainability, We'll tell the sustainability story, and actually we will put a QR code on each of the darn fish that we sell so that you know that fish has been raised sustainably, right? Ran that by consumers, and they threw up all over it, right? I don't want to fish with a QR code. I think sustainability is great, and I applaud you, but I don't know how to cook this fish. I don't know how to buy it at the store. I'm not even used to asking for whitefish by name. So here's where we are. And again, I tell you that that's just as an example of coming up with a strategy for strategic risk. Taking pride in Mexican heritage. I've seen this with other things in Mexico, but Mexicans can be quite negative about their country, but they also want to be very proud of it. And they're, if not, searching for things to be proud of, and holding up is Mexican heritage. What if we pointed out correctly that this is part of Mexican heritage? The name Tutuaba is actually a Nato word. That's what the Aztecs spoke. It's something to be proud of. And what would you be most proud of? Something you could only get in Mexico that was representative of the country. So we just the visuals where we're using. Mexico is the only place in the world, and this is in Spanish, of course, and you show the map and then you light it up around the Sea of Cortez, right? And the punchline, where you can taste and enjoy it. So we've taken the brand concept and linked it to this brand purpose in order to strengthen both, right? But even more, to sort of isolate against that risk of why is it in a supermarket if it's special? Well, of course it's in H-E-B, because it's special Mexican fish, right? And HEB is a special Mexican store, even though it's a supermarket, right? And we emphasize not fine dining, but dining with friends and more casual side, but still celebrating, which fits the brand as well. As I say, it's early days. This is really just illustrating the strategy, not claiming any great success at this point, but I think it's got a pretty good chance, which against the risk, which is after all the probability of failure, having a little less probability of failure is a good thing, right? Along the way, we didn't try to quantify the risk, I'll point out. We did what Mark's recommending, and it's just as qualitatively say, this could get here a lot faster and be a lot bigger than you think, right? And anything you can do to mitigate it. And again, my point is, this is a different kind of conversation than I think marketers usually have with other people in the business. You're speaking their language in a way that you could talk about things you know as a marketer, but sound foreign to them and make it sound not foreign. Anyway, they took to it, the company did finally, to the extent that they renamed the company. That it's now Tetraba Santamar is the company, right? Thereby turning it into a corporate identity for branding the fish, which is actually a name of a species. The treasurer of the Sea of Cortez brings you to Tetraba, right? Again,
Trademark that one.
yeah, again, to repeat myself, the only reason I'm telling you this, not just for a fish story, but the idea is branding is a strategy. We know that, in a sense, I'm using strategy. Companies really don't think about it that way that much. But it's how to manage a strategic asset, to have a strategy for that strategic asset, right? And, okay, I kind of get that. You're going to have to talk about brand financial value to make me think it's an asset. That's why we've been doing what we've been doing, right? But if you do, then you say, okay, the strategy is worth something, so it's worth protecting against risk, which are threats, identify the threat, and if you have this apparatus that Mark's talking about, you need to plug into that as well. If in this context, it's none of the bureaucracy, but the conversation is still the same. Identify the threat. What's the strategic strategy that will address it? And what we know about branding can give you some strategies to do that, right?
I want to ask you a question. Did you use any focus groups on this, or was it, how did you come up with this strategy?
I've done a lot of focus groups. In the last few years, I generally like individual interviews more. There's been a big historical debate over that. I started in marketing research at a company called National Analysts in Philadelphia. It's headed by Al Goldman, who was one of the pioneers in focus groups. And he set me on that course by one night. He wasn't feeling well, and he had a group of psychiatrists, so he told me to go ahead and do a focus group. I'd never even seen a focus group. But you know, it sort of does itself if you see it as a listening exercise. But yeah, I think for most purposes, an individual interview is a lot better for clarity. I don't think people influencing each other is necessarily that big a problem with focus groups. It can be, but it can also be an advantage. There's a long-standing debate over that. But well, let's make one last suggestion. I thank you for those words. I think there's something here for MASB, but this is just a proposal. In talking, we sort of visualized the conversation between CFOs and CMOs and sort of modeled an exercise like this. But I think it's almost a product that MASB could try to offer to companies, how to put CEOs in and the CFOs in a room together and talk about value and risk. God knows we've had enough trouble talking to them about the financial value of the brand, right? But I think if we could maybe get a back door to talk about risk and managing risk, you might wind up at the same place and a better ability to understand each other.
I have a thought on this, taking it beyond the CFO. So one of the most interesting presentations I was asked to give was on brand risk. It was organised by Zurich Insurance, right? Brought me in to a conference of actuaries, which, you know, they're not the most brand-minded people you would think, but they understand the concept of brand risk. They wanted to talk on that topic. So, you know, maybe we actually go a step beyond CFOs and talk to actuaries, because they are open to it, because that's how they think. Yeah.
Well, and I think Mark's comments about risk management and a CEO wanting integrated risk management rather than a silo structure, and thinking about strategy as part of that integrated risk management, that definitely is a CEO conversation, right? That this could be popped into.
I think it's a great idea.
Well, what are you going to be mitigating a MASB risk?
Do you have a risk management officer? Or is that something
I
Frank
don't
does in his
quite-
spare time?
quite have the resources to do that yet. Yes.
The whole concept of strategic brand risk assessment, I think, is critical. 'Cause
It's a very good
one of the
one.
things we don't cover is an escalation at very senior levels of the organization of decisions that have brought risk to brands, but yet it's the CMO's fault. So whether it's a quality spill or an inappropriate pricing decision or a change to distribution, those are never seen as impacting the brand. But labeling it such and bringing accountability to that in the C-suite, I think would have a greater level of understanding and impact.
And I'd add to that list associating the brand too closely with the brand of the CEO. So, you know, Charles Schwab struggled with that one for years. And an example of what can happen, the risks you can expose your brand to, is what happened to Tesla. Associating the brand too closely with Elon Musk. So they, you know, really sabotaged them.
One other thought I forgot very quickly, Frank. Reputation. There's a whole industry out there that's ahead of us, right? They're selling companies the idea instead of brand. They're selling reputation, and what you have to do is crisis management and reputational crises. And they actually talk about the corporate brand, which is not a brand, but there's something to be done in relation to that too.
Yeah. No, sorting that one out, nobody ever has.
Sorry, Frank.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.